I'm always interested. I always find it interesting to want to go beyond blackness or Pan Africanism, and it's just it's the same with the way that post colonial theory just fumbles on race when it comes to race and thinking about the particularities of blackness. I think we might have some of the same tendencies in decolonial theory. So the point is to actually talk about race, and I feel like there's a reluctance, even while acknowledging racism, there's a reluctance to talk about the continuing process of racialization, which is the making of particular identities, and it changes over time, but it still has a particular valence around the specificity of blackness. And I think that's why it doesn't necessarily work for me completely, but everything stumbles on race, right? And so it'd be interesting to see what would happen if the starting point was not to go beyond blackness and instead to think about how it is that kind of question around blackness remains actually shapes our epistemological and theoretical viewpoints.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Pierre. I guess I really don't have a question because your presentation was so concise that every time I thought I had a question,
Oh, thank you.
So I would only want to make a comment about I think it was the Council on African Affairs, and you made mention of Paul Roten, and I just wanted to give a shout out to Eslanda Roten, who was ABD in anthropology and used her own funds to go and study on the African continent, and she eventually wrote a book. She resisted the pursuit of the Ph.D. because, according to Barbara Ransby, she resisted the training. So I just wanted to give a shout out to her, and then to ask you, where does you use the term African studies and Black studies? Where does Africana studies fit within that paradigm?
Right. So thank you. I have to say, I thank you for the shout out to Islanda. She wrote a book called African Journey that was published around the same time as Evans Pritchard's The Newer. But when you're in anthropology, you don't get Islanda, you get The Newer. And so I always teach them together, actually, so that the students know that there were, other people writing about Africa in very different ways. And so thanks for reminding me that. You guys should check out her book called An African Journey. And she was trained by Malinowski, which is like one of the fathers of fieldwork in anthropology. So Africana studies, the appellations are interesting to me. So I do think Africana studies should strive. It should be a combination, right, of these things, right? This supposedly transcontinental tradition, as Martin and West describe, and that's the goal, right? But the ongoing, the ongoing issues are, I think, epistemological and theoretical. It's just, well, where does Africa? How does Africa come in, right, into the discussions in African studies? And I went to grad school during the years when Gilroy was extremely prominent, and the sense was, I was saying this earlier, that any mention of Africa meant Mother Africa and Africa's baseline, so then you're being essentialist, right, as opposed to thinking about contemporary Africa. And so the thing is, I guess it does force to have Africana studies is to think about the transcontinental tradition and to think about Africa in coeval terms with the diaspora. But the question is, does it happen, right, theoretically in terms of the work, or is it just having Africans who do African studies, a department that has different department or centers that have different people that do different things. And so for me, beyond the institutionalization, Africana studies should be an epistemological as well as a theoretical project.
Diego. I guess the narrative that you gave us about Cartier's and CIA involvement in research mirrors a lot of what was happening in Latin America and the anti-communist efforts there too. What I was wondering was, so in Latin America they started setting up these projects where anthropologists would go into a community and then seclude it and then study it and try to basically maximize production, so they were trying to transform indigenous Latin Americans into workers. And this happened in Mexico, in Puerto Rico, in Guatemala. And then what happened was, and this is why your narrative was so powerful, because then other people started replicating them without CIA money, just on their own. They were like, oh, this is great, we'll keep doing it. So I was wondering if, and this might be speculative, if there were any projects kind of like that happening in West Africa, or if not, why was there no interest in creating these kind of like experimental, not that it would be a good idea, but I'm just wondering why that effort didn't translate, why did they pick Latin America as this sort of like,
The anthropologists?
yeah, well, funded by the CIA, so.
Oh, yeah, I don't know much about the CIA. I mean, I actually just got Sinclair Drake's FBI files, so I have the CDs. It'd be interesting to check that out, because, you know, I'm implying that he was the CIA, you know, he was funded by the CIA, which is like Sinclair Drake is our like diaspora daddy, you know, so you can't really say that. But so I don't know about the specific project, but I do know that these cultural, I mean, that's Africanist anthropology. I mean, these studies of like these cultural isolates on the African continent still continue, right? And in fact, I mean, that's one of the things that really pushed me to do something different, right? And so if you look up Africanist ethnographies, you get the same. And so what you're saying is that even those that were not CIA-funded projects become part of the epistemology of approaching African studies, and we still see it today. Yeah. So, if you have a question.
Thank you so much for your talk. I mean, you do such a beautiful job in the book and in the talk of really helping us to understand the sort of intellectual tradition and the twists and turns and how they've brought us here. I'm really curious your take on perhaps some more sort of popular discourses and imaginaries, because of course these intellectual traditions have implications in, you know, outside of scholarly conversations. So one sort of side of this is you talked about Afrocentrism and the sort of critique of essentialism that is in the background of you know, a part of this genealogy. And I'm curious your take on what seems to be a pendulum swing to the opposite, which is Afrofuturism, right? So the kind of consigning of Africa to this past, right? And then the kind of imagination of Africa in sort of futurity, right? And I mean, I'm sure we're all getting ready to go see Black Panther.
I already saw it. I'm just saying, I live in LA.
So I mentioned this because I feel like, for me, it's very interesting to see the ways in which Africa, there's an aversion to Africa in sort of popular conversations and identifications, particularly for folks who do not have known ties to the African continent, to specific African countries. But then we have these moments like Wakanda Fever, where, you know, it's a very particular temporality of Africa that people are comfortable with. And then the other side of that is political struggles of today. This is something I'm thinking about, particularly when we have the movement for Black Lives, and Black Lives Matter, the organization in particular, which lays claim to a sort of global Black radical tradition and the kinds of Black intellectualism and transnational forms of solidarities that you speak to as something we kind of dislocated. But it's like it appears to be an acknowledgement of a globalism sort of theoretically, but not necessarily in practice. Meanwhile, we know that, you know, the African continent has been the site of increasing forms of political struggle, and the coevality of contemporary political struggle in the diaspora in Africa, there seems to be something missing there as well. So I'm just curious your takes on the sort of Afrofuturism piece, and then this dislocation and gap that you're talking about in terms of the intellectual tradition, how you think that might be happening or recurring in our contemporary sort of political moment, or not?
Yeah, so the Afrofuturism is actually a really good question. It's a construction of Africa that's very similar to the earlier construction of Africa as like this distant, not coeval. It's either far away in the future or far back in the past, and there's no there's no real Africa, and actually, there's no real Africa there. Even though there's a bustling African science fiction, set of literature coming out of the continent right now, right? So it's interesting. And I saw this on Twitter. Someone was saying, well, if you think that Black Panther is like the blackest movie ever, you haven't been paying attention to like all the film being made in Nigeria, like Nollywood. Like, so how could you not? And so there's something that's this epistemological shift that structured the way that we study Africa in the diaspora remain. And I think the best example is Black Lives Matter, where there's a trip to Palestine for solidarity, but not to South Africa for Fees Must Fall. No conversation about the Libyans dying in the Mediterranean, and so Lampedusa, or and the militarization. Africom under Obama expanded to 30-something countries, where before they weren't there. So in 8 years, you have the U.S. military all over, and so that's not, except for Professor Dr. Odinga here. There's no work really in terms of in terms of the U.S. militarization. It seems like Africa plays a particular role for U.S. blacks and those in the diaspora that continues in the same I think tradition that I laid out, and I'm not sure the way out of that, because it's so entrenched, right? And epistemologically, it impacts how we begin, like what research we think is important, that I don't see it. And the other thing is, as global as we are, as connected as we are, there's no news, like we don't get news. There was more news coming from the African continent to there was a black press. There's not a black press. The black press used to write about Africa. You don't see that. And so it's really fascinating to see that the more we're connected, the more like real Africa stays out. So those are great examples.
We are getting to the 1 hour mark in the evening, and Dr. Pierre has been with us all day and all night. Unless there's one more burning question that we can cover in 2 or 3 minutes, then we will perhaps call it an evening and thank Dr. Pierre for her